It looks like the big four pattern companies and all of their associated brands will continue to exist for the near future. Now, I think we can all agree that the sale prices we've been paying for patterns over the past few years, and specifically during the summer, are probably on their way out. That means that my pattern stash is all the more valuable. So now instead of cutting out patterns, I'm going to be tracing them off. Today, I'm sharing the best method I've found for tracing patterns and how to do it. Plus, I'm going to be sharing the tools and supplies that I use to get the job done. It's all coming up next, so stay tuned. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is So Lounge. Now, the pattern I'm going to be working with today is this very easy Vogue pattern. This is 9022. I am going to be making the red dress that is version A with the short sleeve because it's Texas and it's still summer down here, even though fall has officially started. I'm going to be making this out of this gorgeous linen that I bought when I was in New York, and I need to trace off this pattern so I don't use the original. I can preserve that for another project down the line, but also because I'm planning to do some fit alterations on this pattern and I want to keep my original intact in case I mess something up and I need to go back and double check any of the markings or measurements. Now, the supplies I use are pretty standard. You can find most of them on Amazon, and I will be including links for everything I use in this video in the description below. So be sure to check that out if you want to pick up any of these supplies. First up is ALVIN tracing paper. Now, this is the tracing paper I use. The specific weight will be in the description below if you want to check that out. The width I use is 36 inches because that's what fits the top of my cutting table perfectly. It also comes in 12 and 24-inch widths. Now, on this roll, which I've been using for quite a while, is 20 yards. That is 60 feet. So it is going to last you for a while, even if you start tracing off everything. This is a nice weight paper. It's not quite as thin as the paper that the patterns are printed on, but it is still manageable and it probably won't tear quite as easily if you use it and fit with it. Next up, we've got my favorite pencil. This is a Ticonderoga Carmine Red erasable pencil. And the reason why it's so awesome is because when you erase with this, if you kind of go crazy and go off your line that you need, or you realize you've traced off the wrong size by accident, you just go in and erase it and it actually erases. I use red because it is easier to see than a regular graphite colored pencil. Because we're using a pencil, you need a pencil sharpener, and not all pencil sharpeners are created equal. This is and hopefully I'm saying this right, STAEDTLER. It's a German art company. This is made in Germany. This is a fantastic pencil sharpener. I got this on Amazon. The only downside is they don't let you pick your color. You get randomly assigned a color and you'll find out when it arrives in the mail. But this is a great pencil sharpener because it doesn't chew up your pencil or break the lead during the sharpening process. And trust me, if you're going to be tracing off a lot of patterns, you need a sharpener to go with your awesome pencils. Next, I have a Papermate felt tip pen. This is what I use to write out the information about the pattern specific. So the number of the pattern, the brand, the piece name, what I need to do with it, if I cut one, if I cut two, if it needs interfacing, that's all gets written in a felt tip pen of a different color so it's easy to see and identify. Now, this is kind of an optional gadget. This is a pattern notcher. So this is what it looks like. It will put little notches where all the triangles are or all the notches are on your pattern. I hate to admit how much I paid for this thing because I bought it back in grad school in the early 2000s and it was, I think it was like $40. You can get these on Amazon anywhere from like $5 to $13 depending on the style you want. Mine was from the bookstore at my grad school. So lesson learned. And then my very favorite tools, which are not on Amazon, but you can pick them up on Etsy. These are seam allowance rulers from Stitch Buzz. They are 5/8 of an inch wide so you can line them up, you can draw your lines and get all your curves in for your pattern tracing, and then you can go back in and mark all your seam allowances. Now, the cool thing about these rulers is they come in different sizes. So if you're in Europe and you want a 3/8 inch, they also come in 3/8, which I also have over here. And they also have 1/2 inch widths, which I also have because some indie patterns have 1/2 inch seam allowances, and that's why I got my other set. I will put a link to Stitch Buzz in the description below so you can check them out. Claire is the owner. She is up in North Texas, just outside of Dallas. And so I like to support a Texas company whenever I can. Her products are amazing. I found her on Instagram and I have happily been ordering her products since then. Last but not least is a rotary cutter and a rotary cutting mat. This is optional. If you like to hand cut your patterns, then a pair of scissors works great. Make sure they're for paper, not for fabric. But if you want to increase your speed and you already have a rotary cutter and a mat, I save my dull blades and then use them to cut either paper patterns or my traced off tissue patterns. So that just helps with some time. It's a little bit faster. You will still need a pair of paper scissors to get into any tight corners, but for the most part, it greatly speeds up the process of, an additional step that you're making before you can go sit down at the sewing machine. One thing to note, I always iron my pattern pieces from the wrong side. That's the back side of the pattern. I've just done this since college. I don't really know why. I just kind of thought that like if there's ink or any kind of printing or anything on the front, I don't want that to come off. And since I've learned how to do tissue fitting, I learned that when you do any kind of alterations to the front of the pattern and use tape, you do not want to iron that side. So I was already in the habit of ironing the back, but if you're interested in learning the tissue fitting method, then you definitely want to just get into the habit of ironing from the wrong side, because if you make any adjustments from the front and tape, you don't want that to melt. So I am just ironing this. I am not pressing. I'm very gently ironing my pattern to get everything nice and smooth. I have my iron set to silk. Any of the dry settings work. I did not pour the water out of my iron, but I have the steam function turned off just to be on the safe side. And if you read the book by Ray Bradbury in high school, you know that paper burns at 451 degrees Fahrenheit. So as long as you're just being careful, you're gonna be fine. Now, once you put tape on the other side of the pattern, then you really need to use a lower setting, but for now, any heat setting to just get your pattern ironed is a good setting. I'm keeping my whole pattern together because I don't want to lose any pieces. That is a problem I have. But of course, if you feel like cutting out the individual pieces before you trace them off, that is totally an option. Now, I'm going to start with the back pattern piece. It is the largest of all the pieces, so that's the one I want to do first. I have it laid out on the table so that the entire pattern piece is on the table, and then the rest of the pattern is hanging off over on this side. I will move it around as I trace each individual piece off. Before I get started with any of my tracing, I always review the pattern instructions to see if there's anything kind of unusual that's not standard in my general sewing method, or if there's any additional markings on the pattern that I need to pay specific attention to, so I don't forget them and then get halfway through the sewing process and realize that I don't have the marks on my fabric. So a couple of things with this pattern, there is a mark at the bottom of the skirt to put a little back slit in that needs to be reinforced. So there's a specific step for that in the pattern instructions. So I need to remember that that mark has to be done. And then also looking at the location of the facing, because I see there's this random dot up here. The facing gets matched with the dot as well as the notches on the shoulder. So I need to make sure that that's in the right place as well, so that once I start transferring everything over to fabric, I can transfer all the markings in the right spots. If you have any pattern weights, this is a good time to pull them out to help keep everything on the table. I have them handy for the next step of adding the paper. Now, when I roll out my paper, I do not roll it so that the roll can keep going off the table. I roll it so that the paper is coming across the top of the roll like this, and then I spread it out because that helps my paper unroll, but it doesn't roll off the back side of the table the first second I move it. So I'm just going to get this all situated. And I'm going to pull my pattern up to the top of the tracing paper to try and maximize my tracing paper. There is a lot on the roll, but I hate wasting paper if I don't have to. And this is kind of one of those instances where you can fit a lot more pattern pieces in than what was originally printed on the paper because you can just move it around to suit your needs. Okay, that looks good. I'm gonna pull out some of these little pattern weights that my sister made me and just kind of plunk them down on areas where I'm not going to be tracing so I do not have to move them later, just to hold the paper on top of my pattern. When you do this process, oh wait, it's too far off the table. Hold on. I got to push it back a little bit. There we go. I am going to be making the medium, which is the largest size in this pattern, and I freehand some of this, and then the straight lines I generally don't, but the curves I usually just freehand because I find that I can do them a little bit faster. And then if something looks a little wonky, I go back in with my curve and clean it all up. This is just a close up so you can kind of see closer what I'm doing. You can kind of see the size of the pencil line. The actual printed line is on the thick side, so I don't think having a slightly thick pencil to do this. I have previously tried this with a mechanical pencil, and I found that the line is a little bit too thin to be able to see it really well once you go and cut it out. Now, here's the beautiful erasing quality of this pencil and why it's so awesome. As you can see, that line's just entirely disappeared. And then I can go back in and draw it a little bit better than I did the first time around. There we go. So you can see that's why I use this. Now I'm going to be drawing lines and making marks at the same time. I like to color in the various shapes on the pattern pieces so I know where they are, and then I can punch them out or put a hole in them later once we get to that step in the process. But for now, I'm just going to do it that way. Moving down, this is where the notch is going to be. I'm still going to color in this triangle. And there is a slight curve in this. And I'm just going to continue this whole process of marking the pieces. Now, going down the center front, I'm going to use the straight edge and get my line in place. And then I'm just going to keep moving down. So this is where I kind of hand drew in a curve. I'm going to put in these notches as well. Color them in so I can see them because that is a huge component of this. Now you may be wondering why I'm using a big 4 pattern instead of an indie pattern. Indie patterns, while they share a lot of the same markings, they do not have everything marked. So this is an instance where you can really see everything that needs to be marked on a pattern, and I'm going to be marking it all so that for demonstrative purposes. So there's a center back mark on here. There's also a waistline mark. That is not always on the indie patterns. The grain lines are on. I'm also going to mark that. Because that is a crucial element of what we need to transfer. I'm just continuing down this sleeve. There was a slight curve, but then because this is a kimono sleeve, it's going to straighten out. Now I want to make sure that my line is going to be marked. So I'll be able to see it once I lift this all up. Yeah, that's dark enough. Now I'm moving down to this sleeve part. If I was making the full length sleeve, I would keep going, but I'm going to just go across So this has a slight curve to it. So I'm just going to walk my seam allowance around. See, and I got off the line. Just look how great that erases. I mean, that's just fantastic. Let's go in a little closer so you can see how awesome that line is. You can see how it's just totally erased. It's fantastic. I'm not doing great with this today, but I am showing you how well this pencil erases, which is just as important. There we go. Okay, I got it. Okay. I'm coming back around. There is a slight um, change of direction here where it's kind of straight and then it's going to kind of come back out. There we go. Now I'm going to be moving into the curved section. This is when these type of rulers come into play. So I can just move the curve wherever I need it to get the same depth as that's a little bit as what is showing up. I'm just going to cheat this part out and draw it by hand because that looks pretty good. I need the bigger curve for down here. And that's just how I'm going to continue getting all of these lines into place and continue this whole process around the rest of the pattern until it's all traced off. I am going to mark in these lengthen or shorten lines. I'm just going to draw one down the middle between the two because I need to do a sway back adjustment on this pattern. And this is where I think it needs to go. But just in case it doesn't, I also have the waistline marked right here. This is the marking for, I think this is the width of the sleeve here at the arm. And so I'm just gonna mark that off. And then once I go back in, I'll write what the size is for the medium through this area. So this is the measurement between this shoulder seam here and this armhole seam. So you know how wide that's going to be in there. That's this measurement here, and I'm just going to go write it in just a second. Now that I have my pattern traced out, just the basic outline, all the notches and the marks put in, I'm going to go back in with my felt tip pen and start transferring the information. So this is Vogue V9022. I'm going to write the size I'm making on this pattern because I have not done that in the past and then forgotten which size I cut out. So this is the instructions to cut 2. This is piece number 4. It is the back. They have this as the back facing, but technically this isn't the facing, this is the entire back piece. So over here, the medium is going to be 15.5 inches on here on the sleeve. What other information do I need? Over here, it says this neckline is 1.5 inches below the base of the neck. So I'm going to write that on here because I know I'm going to need to adjust that. And I want to know how much it's going to be when it's finished. Now moving down, this is the center back, so I'm just going to write CB on here because I know that. This is the waistline. I'm going to write WL. And then this is the grain line, so I'm going to write grain line on that. You don't have to do all these abbreviations if you don't want to. It is kind of personal preference. For me, having done this before, I feel like the more information I have on my pattern, the better. So let me just put this is for A and B versions. And then I think I'm going to write Vogue dress with kimono sleeve. This is just in case I get some of these patterns out of order or misplace them somehow. The last thing I'm going to do, because I am going to tissue fit this, I'm going to go and draw in all of my seam allowances. Now, this is where these rulers from Stitch Buzz really come in handy, is because you just line everything up and you just start drawing, and I'm going to pin it together at the seam lines, which is why I need to know where those are. So this is not a step you have to do if you are not doing any tissue fitting, but since I'm going through the process of tracing this all off, and I know that there will probably be a couple of fit issues with this dress just by looking at it, I'm going to make those adjustments and then before I cut out the fabric so that I know it'll fit really well. Now for the test to make sure everything transfers, and it looks like the same pattern once I lift it up. And so far, so good. I have everything transferred where it needs to be. And, I can read the pattern information so I won't misplace this with other patterns at some point in the future. Now, moving forward, this is the cool thing about, being able to do this yourself is you can start moving the pattern pieces wherever they're going to fit into your tissue. So I've got to trace off the two facings for the front and the back. And so I just pulled those in right here. So they're really close to the sleeve, but I have everything drawn out. So I know that it's not going to be a problem to put those that close together. Since this is paper, I don't have to worry about grain lines. I just need to make sure I transfer everything to my individual pattern pieces so that I will have that information saved. So I'm going to resume the process. These pattern pieces are right in the middle, so I'm going to pull it a little bit closer to me so it's a little bit easier to get to and film. And next, we're going to be moving on to the facings and getting all of that traced off so that I can, continue this whole process and move the big pattern underneath. This is another reason why I like to keep the main pattern intact, is because then you can slide it around under your tracing paper and it still stays together. It's easy to move and you can use as much of this paper as possible without wasting it. You want to save it to use as much as you possibly can. So I think, yeah, the other pieces are pretty big. I think I can put this panel, which is the lower side of the front of the skirt, I think that'll fit here next to the facings, but then I'm going to have to roll my paper out and then do the front and the front panel, which is a long piece, and then the front sleeve. I usually start with all the straight lines first because then that way I feel like I'm making progress, and then go back in and do those curved lines. Okay. I just realized this would be so much easier if I had my reading glasses on. Ah, so much better. I'm going to put these over here. There we go. So it's pretty much just the same process, going around and getting everything transferred and making sure that it's all lined up properly. Now, sometimes when you're using indie patterns, they'll have like all the pattern sizes on the same page. And then in those instances, what I'll do, draw on the size for the original pattern so that I can see the line when I have everything all lined up, because sometimes they're a lot closer together once you start tracing, and it's hard to see which line is which. But this is very easy. It only has 3 sizes. This is the extra small, small, and medium of this pattern, and the larger sizes are in a different envelope, which makes it a little bit easier to see. It's another reason why I chose this pattern to trace off. And these shoulder triangles are like one of those things that I didn't ever think were super important, and I pretty much never, ever transferred them. And then I found out that I kind of really needed to, because it's going to show you where the facing lines up on the shoulder seam. That's why it goes through the seam line. I'm going to still mark the center back so that I know where that is on my pattern. This one is ready for writing. So this is the back facing. This has additional instructions, so it's not just cut fabric, we need to cut two in interfacing. Okay, I think that one's done. Let's move on to the other facing. Put that pen away. Now, one thing you might notice as you start tracing off patterns or maybe paying more attention to patterns in the general is that the markings on patterns are very standardized. Obviously, this was started with the big four pattern companies, and thankfully, the indie designers have kept up with it. This is a put on fold mark. They're going to all look the same on any kind of pattern you use, just like grain lines are always straight. Most of the time, they will have a marking indicating a notch, and other markings tend to be fairly standardized as well. So once you kind of get the hang of what you need to look for, it won't be too difficult. Okay, double checking my work. There are my pattern pieces so far. Everything is there, and now I need to really move my pattern sheet around so that I can fit that last piece over here. Pull it up so we can get as much use of this paper as possible. Just gonna put my little weights back in place. There we go. Get all my rulers. I think that's it. Okay. So it's not a super complicated process. It just takes time. And if you're like me and you just want to sit down and start sewing, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but unless you have duplicates of your pattern and you're willing to cut one and sacrifice it for the cause to be able to get started sewing faster, I think this is going to become one of those necessary evils that we're all going to have to participate in. Whether we're using, commercial or indie patterns to just, you know, keep sewing, moving forward, and holding on to our patterns for, our paper patterns for posterity. So this is one of the reasons why I have not sewn a lot of indie patterns, because I didn't want to do this step. So hopefully now that I'm really getting the hang of doing the tracing off, it's going to be a lot faster for me to do the indie patterns. So the plan is to start seeing some more of those mixed into the rotation so that it's not just always the big four, which, it's what I grew up using and what grandma always sewed for me. And, it's just kind of, I think, what everybody's really just used to. This isn't a straight line. This has a slight curve in it. That's very interesting. That's one thing you'll learn when you start looking at patterns, that like lines that look straight aren't necessarily perfectly straight. Huh. Hopefully that's printed correctly. That's what I'm going to hope for. So I know some of these angles are a little unusual, but I'm not trying to be artistic. I'm just trying to get you to be able to see what I'm working on and, get a good view. My other lamp tripod or lamp phone holder is not working super well. And so I'm trying the tripod instead. Okay, so here's some more of those interesting details. There's a fold line here, which I believe is for the pocket that is going to be part of the design of the dress. That's why the front panel is shorter than the back panel, because we're going to be adding this second line with the there's like folding and then you sew them together. I'm not sure exactly how it works yet. We'll see once we get to it. This is the other mark. This, I believe, is the hip line mark. So I want to definitely be sure to put this one in. And then I'm going to come back and write the sizing on that. One thing I forgot to put on the other pattern when we did the back was the hem, the amount of the hem that's included in the pattern. I like to transfer that so then I don't have to go back and look. I'll just know. Okay, so that looks like everything is marked. Ah, we did not mark this top triangle. That's very important. Are there any other triangles anywhere? Nope, it does not look like there are. So I think this is going to be good to go. Let me get my other pen. So this is 42 inches at this hip line. This is Vogue pattern piece 1. That is happening there. I'm going to draw in my seam lines. so that I don't forget about that. Oh, this is that weird part where it's not exactly straight, so let me come back and make sure I have that all lined up right. All right, so that is all in, and then I need to write the hem down here. That's the one thing that I forgot. 1 1/4 inches. And now that piece is ready to go. We're going to slide everything down. If you're following along, the piece we are getting ready to trace off is going to be this outside sleeve panel, which is one piece. It only goes to this pocket mark, so that's the separate piece that we previously made. And it's a good thing we're doing the short sleeve version because the sleeve ends here and the table ends right here, and the long sleeve version is hanging off the side. I would much rather just cut out my pattern, cut my fabric, and start sewing than doing all of these parts. But there is a certain zen in taking the time to do all of these steps and, you know, make it all come together. It also is a good way to pay attention to the various components of the design and the different ways that the pattern is put together. If you're interested in pattern making, this is one of those exercises that will help you recognize the different parts of the pattern, what needs to be included, how you put things together, and all that good stuff. Now, when I was starting to make patterns in college, now mind you, I was still learning to sew while I was learning to make patterns. So it was not, I was not great at pattern making, I'm not gonna lie. I did not know that I needed to straighten out my lines, which seems to be very basic that you would do that. And as a result, occasionally I would make something and the skirt would flare out on one piece, but the other piece would be straight. It kind of just depends on how I draped it. So if my piece wasn't exactly rectangular and it tapered to one end, well, that's what the pattern piece looked like because I didn't know I needed to true everything up. So that's another good reason to go through these steps so you can just familiarize yourself with the entire pattern process. My plan in college was to, you know, try and sew more commercial patterns to learn more about, you know, what needs to be on patterns and how patterns look when they're flat and all that good stuff. And it just didn't happen. So, you know, college. I had other classes that weren't fashion related. I had, you know, night clubbing to do and, you know, boys to chase. You're in your early 20s, that's what you do. It's part of life. So anyway, I've gotten better since then. That's the important part. So I'm just marking my little notches so I remember them. That was another thing that I was never great at was making the marks to put my pattern back together after I took it off from having it draped. All right, so I'm just going to finish tracing this whole piece off. And then we have one more piece, which is the single panel that's cut on the fold that is on the front that connects the either side of the front together and that the pocket lower skirt panel all attaches to. So I missed a mark here. There we go. All right, I'm going to finish tracing this sleeve, get the rest of the markings all done. And then I have to slide my paper and rearrange everything to get that last piece, pattern piece, ready to go. So this is one of those instances when it would be helpful to have like another roll, like a tube to roll my excess pattern on so that it doesn't fall off the table. But I think I'm just going to use one of my little bean bags up here to kind of hold this in place while I trace off this last piece, which is very long and narrow. I'm trying to see where it starts. I'm trying to make the most of my paper, especially because I just realized I'm running close to the end of the roll, which is shocking because I did not know that I've been using it this long, but I guess I have. So I'm going to have to definitely order some more. I'm going to make sure my tracing paper stays on the table and that the pattern is the only piece hanging off because that'll just make my life a little bit easier to keep everything nice and smooth. That ends there. Okay. Very last piece is going to be this center front panel. So it's going to be cut on the center fold, and then I got to make sure I have all the marks transferred so that once I start attaching all the various pieces, it works. And oh, this has the waistline on it too. So the waist is 39 inches in a medium on this pattern. And put my center fold mark here to remind me which piece this is, because this is going to be the actual center front of the garment. My waistline is here, so I want to be sure that I mark that. Now, if you do want to do any of these lengthening or shortening lines so you can adjust it once you get it on, you can mark those lines in as well. I'm not going to do that. I very rarely need to lengthen or shorten anything. This is the shorter version of the dress, which is what, actually, I think there's only one version. Yes, there's only one version of this dress. It is above the knee or at the knee length, depending on how much I hem. If I go with the hem of the pattern, or if that's a little bit long on me, then I'll shorten it a little bit. I tend to make shorter dresses just because I am only 5'5", and any kind of significant length on a dress tends to just look bad and makes me look like way shorter than I actually am. So the good thing about this piece is it's pretty straight. So it's going to be pretty quick to knock out. And other than making sure that I get all these notches and everything marked, I do need to put the seam line on this side. The other side is the center front, so it does not need a seam line, which is very convenient. The seam lines that I'm adding do not have to be perfect because I am just using that for tissue fitting purposes. I'm not going to be transferring any of those marks to my fabric. All right, last step is mark the pattern piece. This is the front. We're now at the point of the process where I just folded my pattern back up, but this is much easier to get into the envelope than if it was all individual pieces. So I'm gonna stand by my keep it on the original sheet and do not cut out individual pieces plan. And now's the time to cut everything out. So I'm going to grab my rotary mats to put back on my table so I can cut this out with my rotary cutter and not damage my tabletop or accidentally slice myself, because I've already done that. Let's switch out the blade of my rotary cutter. This is when it's really handy to hang on to your old blades that are too dull to cut fabric, because they're great for cutting paper. Like, they're still good for that. They just, they're the ones that, like, you're cutting it with a fabric and then you have like one teeny tiny thread that doesn't get cut for some strange and unknown reason. So anyway, I'm going to use one of these. These are actually some of Anna's old blades, and she wrote dull on them, and it's yellow, which is different from my clear one where I keep all my good blades. So I am just going to use that. I have a pretty steady hand, and I'm going to be cutting on the outside of the red line. If it's not perfect, that's okay, because I can always clean it up later when I go in with my fabric and trim it out at that point if it's a little bit off. I always cut on the outside of the line. That way you still can see the line and you know where it is. And that's another reason why using this pencil is a good system, because it's a nice thick line so you can see it real well and cut alongside of it. And then once that piece is done, I'm going to roll my paper back onto the tube that the remaining paper is on. And then we'll move this piece out of the way. All right, so that's the center front piece. I'm just going to lay it over here over my chair. And now I'm going to roll this up to that sleeve so I can start spreading the rest of my pattern out. All right, so now I'm going to very carefully get this whole piece rolled off, and then now there won't be too much hanging off the end of my table. I need to get everything lined back up over here. There we go. Because I still want to keep this paper smooth while I'm going through this whole cutting process, because it's just gonna, everything's just gonna work better if it's all nice and flat. So just to continue and do the other pieces, I think I'm gonna take these small pieces out first, and I might just cut some of the bigger pieces and then do the fine cutting a little bit later once parts aren't hanging off the table, because I think that's going to be a lot easier and probably going to be a lot safer too. Just there's a couple of lines that now that they're not on top of the actual pattern, I can see that they could be a little bit thicker. So I'm just going to go over them by hand. Here. Okay. Yes. All right. Looking good. Put this back in my hair so I don't lose it. I think I'm just going to rough cut some of these pieces to just get this process going. Plus this one is hanging off the table. So I'm going to put a beanbag on this one so he doesn't go anywhere. Do not get carried away with this. I almost just caught the edge of my facing with my enthusiasm. And also going to try and cut these kind of as close so that I can save some of this paper. If I have any facings or anything that show up later, I will have some little scraps to do those smaller pieces on. It's a pretty big piece right here. Move that out of the way. Pull this up. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit better job now that we have everything on the table and nothing hanging off. Okay, now I see this is kind of a thicker line over here. This is going to be the corner that makes the slit in the back of my skirt, and so I need to get my scissors out to get a nice sharp cut there because the rotary cutter is not going to be able to do that and make it look good. There we go. So you can see I'm cutting this a little bit easier, just going on the outside line. And I'm just all right, so the facings are done. I'm going to pin these together so that they are easier to keep track of. I just realized cutting out the sleeve that I stopped the seam allowance right here for some inexplicable reason. So let me get that lined up. Work that in. Oh, and apparently I didn't put a seam allowance on the front of this side panel, which needs to connect to the center front panel. So let me do that real quick, because I do need to try this on and see how it's going to fit. And I also need one down here. Look at me realizing all the things that I didn't do. It's okay. That's the whole point of doing this now, is so that then I can catch these mistakes so that once I get to the next step, I'll have everything marked that needs to be marked. So this is over here. And this is the lower front side piece. It looks like I did mark all the seam allowances on this one, so it should be pretty quick to just get cut out. I'm going to darken a couple of these lines real quick. There we go. All right. Let's get this piece cut out. As everything falls to the floor behind me. It's okay. It all rolled up into a nice little coil, so that is the good thing about this paper not being completely flat yet, is that when it falls over, it just rolls itself up. Damn it. That's what I was trying to avoid. Okay. I need a Band-Aid. It's times like these when I wish my husband was home to triage. And now I've got blood on my pattern. Well, now we know what happened. Band-Aid was not going to cut it. actually is pretty significant. However, I think if I apply enough pressure, I've got tape around this, I think I'll be okay. So let me finish cutting this out a little bit more carefully and move my hand out of the way before I enthusiastically roll the blade. And we were doing so well. I hadn't had any injuries today, which was quite miraculous. Okay. I guess that one wasn't quite as dull as I thought it was. Um, or, maybe finger is easier to slice than fabric. I do not know. All right. Since we are almost done, I'm going to push through. This last part is kind of really super fun because we're going to make notches and punch some holes. I will say that you do not have to punch any holes with your awl or your stiletto if you do not want to. I'm going to be making tailor tacks because this fabric is so printed, and I need to be able to just pull them through, and I don't want to tear any of the pattern as part of that process. And I cannot find my stiletto. There it is. Of course it fell on the floor. Everything falls on the floor. All right. So let me rearrange the camera and then we will move on to this very last, very fun step. So I'm just going to line up the tip. You see, it kind of has a little triangular shape, so you can line it up with your triangles pretty well. And then it makes a nice little notch like that. It just makes it a little bit easier to see once you have your fabric all laid out. And it's very rewarding. You feel like you're making an accomplishment. So here we are once again. Just line up the triangle shaped top with the notch. And then you get a nice little notch here to help you out later. So there you have it. Now you know my steps for tracing off patterns and what I have found to work the best. If you like my method, be sure to let me know how it turns out for you. Based on everything I've done, I think this works the best. So obviously I needed to share it with you because the days of tracing patterns are upon us, at least for the foreseeable future, until we know with certainty that paper patterns are still going to be around for, longer than just, the next couple of years. So if you've enjoyed this video, you totally want to check out this video coming up next. I know you're going to love it, and I'll see you over there.